Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, which explores the topic of decarbonising global freight, looking specifically at how businesses can reduce their transport emissions and measure the results of their efforts. We'll be talking about why companies from freight forwarders to shippers and carriers need to move forwards on measuring and reducing their carbon emissions, and how they can work towards their net zero targets. Now, this webinar comes on the back of a white paper that Wakeo conducted at the start of the year, where we looked at how corporations can rethink how they consider sustainability, from seeing it as a constraint to recognizing it as a potential long-term benefit and a source of innovation. We explored several promising practices and technologies that can be applied by shippers, forwarders, and carriers across a multimodal freight sector, many of which can have almost instantaneous positive effects. One of the key enablers that we focused on in the paper was collaboration. How by working together collectively, we will have best chance to reach our collective aim of net zero emissions. And this is a theme that we will pick up on again today. Now, I have the pleasure of the company of Moritz Tölke, who is Senior Manager of Environmental Sustainability at Sovereign. Sovereign is a Europe-wide express road and air logistics provider, running 200 trucks and a small charter airline fleet with warehouses across Europe. And I have Joannon, who is the Lead Product Manager, Carbon Footprint Specialist at Wakeo. I will let them both introduce themselves quickly now. So, Moritz, why don't you begin?
Thank you, Lindsay. Very happy to be here. Very happy to see also so many people joining in for this topic. As you said, I'm the decarbonization lead at Sovereign Speed, an asset-heavy carrier. I've been starting at Sovereign, I think, 10.5 years now. So I've been around in the logistics management world for a while. I had the pleasure between 2020 and 2022 to join the Smart Freight Center for 2 years, which is the leading industry NGO for decarbonizing logistics. And they are setting more or less the frameworks and standards for CO2 reporting and reductions. So I've been able to learn and obtain a lot of knowledge there. And now, since last year, I'm back at Sovereign, trying to implement some of these solutions and frameworks into the practice. As an asset-heavy carrier, we have an own consumption of more than 5 million liters of fossil diesel. So we have a lot on our plates to decarbonize. This topic is driven by our business development team, which I'm part of at Sovereign. I think that's worth noticing here, as we believe this topic can only be brought forward with our customers in, as you said, a collaborative approach. So we've been working there with various partners, and I'm very happy to share today some of our experiences with the wider group here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Moritz. Michelle.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Joannon. I'm very happy to be here as well to talk about this particular topic. So I'm the lead product manager at Wakeo. And prior to that, I was a consultant in the transport industry, specialized in the railway, actually. And now I've been working at Wakeo for 4 years. I'm leading all the product developments that we have in our solution, and especially all the carbon emission calculation that we've been implementing in the past years, and the next features that we will in the coming months implement as well on this particular topic.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Thank you to you both. Okay. Just a note, the format of today's webinar will be a conversation between the three of us, with about 15 minutes at the end for you, our attendees, to ask our experts any questions that you may have on the topic of decarbonisation. There won't be any slideshows to watch, just our three faces. So we will do our best to ensure that key facts and concepts are clearly highlighted for you. Now let's begin. Charles, as an introduction, could you provide us with a general overview of the situation as you see it in global freight now with regards to decarbonisation?
Yes. So first, before talking about decarbonization, I think it's important to understand the weight of the transportation in the global greenhouse gas. So transportation activities is the second emitter in terms of greenhouse gas, and it's responsible for around 17% of emissions globally. So it's very important, as we can see, to talk about decarbonization, and we see that there are coming new regulations and targets that are being set by countries and regions now, but there is no universal regulations in terms of scope 3 emission. And as a reminder for those who are not familiar with this, the scope 3 emissions account for indirect upstream and downstream emissions of a company. So this is the type of scope that includes the transportation for all companies, for shippers and forwarders. And as there is no generic regulation, we see that now countries are implementing their own law. For instance, in France, since the Loi Grenelle 2, all companies with more than 500 employees now need to report on their scope 3 emission. We also see that at a regional level, there are some new laws. For example, the European Council approved the CSRD, so the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which makes it now mandatory for all companies with for 50,000 companies to measure, report, and show action plan to reduce their scope 3 emission. And finally, we also see that the different industries are starting to act. For instance, we have the International Maritime Organization that just released the IMO 2023, which makes it now mandatory for all ships with more than 5,000 gross tonnage to report on their new indicator, which is the carbon intensity indicator. And they've set an important goal, which is to reduce the greenhouse gas by 50% by 2050. So we see that transportation is a big emitter and there are some new laws. But if we look at what companies are setting in terms of targets, we are quite far behind what needs to happen. If we simply look at the largest companies, only 50% of them have set a decarbonization target by 2030. And if we add up all those targets, then we see that this will lead to a reduction of only 20% of emission. But if we want to respect the Paris Agreement, we need to go to 43% reduction compared to 2019. So in terms of decarbonization, things are starting to happen, but we are still very far below what needs to be set as engagement to respect the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And so just to pick up on those key points, so transportation is a massive sector when it comes to carbon emissions, second largest, about 17% of global emissions being related to transport. So it is a significant player when we're thinking about reaching our global targets. And as you say, when we're looking at how the large corps are acting, we've got only about 50% of them now setting targets for 2030, and a large gap to close between if you add those up, the 20% reduction in emissions by 2030 that those actions would achieve versus the 43% that the Paris Agreement says is necessary. So yes, indeed, some work to be done. Yep. I will just pass that question over to Moritz and just say specifically when we're looking at freight transportation, I was wondering what your feeling is on that, Moritz, and particularly with your insight in regards to road and air transport.
First of all, I like Charles' call to action there. So, okay, something is happening, but it's not happening maybe fast enough. And I would share that view. I think there has been, for a long time, we're talking also now about transportation, and I think there has been a focus on public transportation a lot of times, and maybe private transportation, and freight has not been that much high in awareness of the public or also the regulators, which I think is starting to change. We can see large companies, Tölke mentioned it, setting goals, setting science-based targets, also a lot of the logistics service providers and shippers in their scope 3 emissions. And I think it's always a mix of the awareness of the industry and the possibilities that the industry has. If we look at ocean or air, I think there's a higher awareness these days. It's larger companies that are the carriers in these industries. They are able to put, let's say, investments into the space, and are also very more aware of this topic. While when you look at road, for example, we have over 500,000 SME carriers, so small and middle-sized operators in Europe, which might one of all not be aware of the topic that much, and also not necessarily have the means to really dive into it or invest into it. On the other hand, there might be more possibilities for them at the moment to reduce already emissions through operational measures and so on, which, for example, in the airline space might be a bit more difficult because you can only have so much efficiencies with the airplane, and then you might have now turns towards sustainable aviation fuel. So I think we always have to look at these different modes in a different way. But in general, I can see that over the last years, I think the awareness has increased a lot. It's not where it should be potentially, but I think it's come a long way, especially in the last 3 years, for a lot of companies showing up. But I think it's important to keep that pressure up, and now also have the regulations focusing in on freight, as we saw in France, as we're seeing it in the EU as well in general now, and then in the different modes, as Charles has mentioned, for example, for sea, to have regulations pushing this trend, and obviously a collaboration to be then exchanged.
Indeed. And I think we're all in agreement that there are some good strong positives here. I think we can see that action is indeed now being taken across the industry. So Charles, you've been mentioning the IMO 2023's targets 50% reduction by 2030. It does feel that we're now witnessing a growing desire to decarbonize from all the different actors associated with global freight across carriers, shippers and freight forwarding companies. So Moritz, can you tell us what your main drivers are for reducing the environmental impact of your operations?
Yes, of course. I think there's in general 3 drivers that we have. Not going to rank them. They're just 3 similar drivers. On the one hand, regulations, as we just discussed it. We are falling under the CSRD that Charles has mentioned. So we are obliged to report on our emissions. And there's also obviously additional regulations coming in for the EU taxonomy from banks, when investors, shareholders that are demanding a more rigid setup from our side in reporting. We see the customers starting to ask, one, for the reporting, but especially also asking for solutions. And that's how we really see our positioning, because we are in the end the carrier that has the assets, right? And so if the large companies have their scope 3 targets set for 2030 or beyond, they can really only reach those targets when companies like ours are able to support them on their journey. So we see that a huge driver for us to support our customers in offering the solutions. And then I think there's a natural responsibility felt from burning 5 million liters of fossil fuel. So we as a company see the responsibility to act in the means that we have towards our communities and our employees. And then that all comes together in where we are today.
Yes, indeed. And I think I didn't miss, but also obviously there are cost savings to be made as well when we're thinking about the operational efficiencies that can be put into place. That does in many ways can confer a streamlining and a room for savings to be made when made efficiently.
For sure, and I think that's sometimes maybe overlooked. on the outside that especially the first steps and especially the efficiency gains that you can make can have some significant reductions already, and they don't necessarily need upfront investments or huge risk looking into the future, but they can actually result in cost efficiencies, because I mean, in the end, if you reduce your consumption of diesel, you also are able to save some costs on those liters. So I think sometimes that goes hand in hand, which makes it appealing, especially for some low-hanging fruits.
Absolutely so, yeah. And for shippers and freight forwarders, those drivers will naturally be a little different. Would you agree, Charles?
Yeah, but I can see some similar drivers as well. For me, I see just like Moritz, three main drivers for shippers and forwarders. So first, it's the same as the carriers, is now to ensure that they are compliant with the regulations. For sure, they used to be less regulations in terms of scope 3. Now they are more and more regulation on that. It's very important for them to move on this part. And then the second one would be to have a supply chain that is more resilient and to de-risk in the future, actually. Because, for instance, when they move to carbon efficient or even neutral alternatives, then it reduces the exposure towards the fuel price volatility, for instance, and also it limits the impact of restrictions that will come in the future towards fossil fuels. So it's really about limiting the risk for them. And the third one, of course, it's same as for carriers. It's simply to meet a real demand that is happening now. We see that more consumers and also procurement departments are now requesting CO2 transparency and also action plans for companies. So now our customers, so both shippers and forwarders, they see that as a way to respond to those kind of needs. And also, if they act now, they will be the first to be able to be very transparent and to show action plan. And in the future, it's an investment now, but then they will gain market share as well by doing so.
Yeah, that's a great point. So actually, quite a lot of similarities. So we're seeing the sort of main drivers as being pressure from clients, compliance, and potentially more a point about resilience and de-risking when we're talking about the things that might be affecting more your freight forwarders and shippers. So generally that pressure from clients exists across all parties, and the general consensus, as we're seeing, is it's something that will build rapidly in the coming years with questions regarding a company's specific action plan. So actually the real details of how they're going to start to decarbonize. Those increasingly being built, as Charles said, by procurement into RFPs, into tender documentation. So companies will be seeing that more and more. And I think that's really, really important, that we'll see that pressure then sort of ripples out throughout the supply chain. And in doing so, thus it proliferates down from the large corporations who probably have those frameworks and strategies first, filtering down to their suppliers and to the smaller corporations, smaller organizations, but also upwards from all the way from consumers upwards, as the general consensus is that people want to work with more sustainable companies who have true commitments to decarbonization, which I think is very positive indeed.
Yeah.
Now, Moritz, going back to regulations, you mentioned that as being one of the main drivers that you see. And those regulations fundamentally require, at least now, that companies monitor and measure. But as we've discussed, we're seeing them now evolving. We're seeing, for example, the CSRD, them evolving to require that companies actually define those action plans and have precise target reductions to work towards net zero emissions. I know with Sovereign, that's in your core offer to be climate neutral. But as a transport company, as you said, diesel is the blood that fuels you, and this will be, of course, challenging. How do you manage that at Sovereign? Did you implement a methodology, a framework to measure and act?
And you're referring here to one of our main products, the carbon neutral 9-hole network, which is where it all started 25 years ago with the company, with our express network in Europe. And we made the decision 3 years ago to put that on a climate neutral level through offsetting, though. But unfortunately, we do not have the solutions today available in the market to run it on net zero, so not emitting any emissions, which is the target down the line. I think the aim will be to reach that mid next century and the next decade, sorry. And we will be able to bring down our emissions until then, I think, through various different elements in reducing and avoiding. For now, the climate neutral statement comes through offsetting, which is the only way for us at the moment to have it at least a balanced zero. But it is really just a supporting factor of the overall decarbonization journey. It does, however, require an integrity in the numbers, because also offsetting, and maybe especially offsetting, has some challenges in its integrity. So for us, it was very important to have actual numbers when we do something like that. So it came at the same time that we were looking into our emissions years back, and we were looking at the overall emissions of our network based on primary fuel consumption. So we started to look at the absolute numbers of all the infrastructure that we run, and did a corporate carbon footprint and a product footprint. And based on that, we are doing the offsetting. But we also realized how important it is to use these numbers, not just for integrity, but also to understand going forward hotspots where to reduce, and also showcase reduction effects. So that's why it was so important for us to go down into the transport level as well, and also a vehicle level, a lane level. So to really understand where are the emissions coming from, how can they be influenced, and how can we also track certain reduction measures like efficiency gains, driver trainings. And we can only really capture those if we start calculating the emissions based on primary data on such a granular level. So it's not just for the regulation or for the climate neutral claim at the end, but it's also really to understand where we can drive our actions.
That's really great, and that's just a really nice key point to pick up on, is that when we want to be able to make real improvements, we really need to have a grasp of those real numbers, the actual numbers. And the more granular that we can be in understanding those numbers, then the greater the control and the room for improvements that we can have. So when we really drill down into per truck, per shipment, that's when we can really see where efficiencies can be made and improvements can be made. You can really identify hotspots. I think that's an excellent point there, Charles. Moritz. So Charles, are you noticing more customers reporting on their scope 3 emissions, and I guess requesting that data from you?
Yeah, this is clearly something that we've seen lately, and we see that there is even an increasing frequency on requesting that data from us. Actually, we already have 1/3 of our customers who are reporting their scope 3 emissions thanks to Wakeo, and it's been clearly increasing in the past months. And the thing is, like, why are they requesting that data from us? First, because now they need to report on scope 3 emission, and also if they want to take actions to reduce, they need to measure the baseline. So they need to know where they are now, and then they can start working on reduction. And our customers are not carbon emission experts, they are supply chain experts. So they do not know how to calculate the emissions, or it's a complex way to do that. You have to follow the GLEC framework if you want to have the right way or the standard way, and you have to follow the European norm as well. And for them it's quite a nightmare if they want to do it internally. Then they also have the possibility to externalize it with their carriers or with their third parties. But by doing so, they will sum up different methodologies, because each carrier can do his own calculation, or each forwarders, when you're a shipper, can do that. And so it's very hard for them, because at the end they are comparing apples and oranges if they do so. So the best way for them is to have one single source, and that's why we are here for them, to respond to this need. And I think that seeing the new regulations as well, we can only predict that this will keep on increasing in the future.
That's a great point. And again, just to touch, in order for improvements to be made, you need your baseline.
Yeah.
You need to know where you're starting from to be able to know where you want to get to. So that data needs to, you need to understand your current operations as they are now, and that data really is imperative to build off. Now, thinking about solutions, are there any technologies or innovative practices that that you guys see as being game changers for advancing the sustainability of the sector? I'll start with Moritz again.
Yeah, I think there's always very interesting development when it comes to the solution side. But I think what's very interesting to see is that it doesn't always need the newest technologies, and sometimes we might be waiting around for the e-truck to come around, and it is coming. We can see it, and potentially hydrogen as well. I think a core philosophy of ours at Savoy, but also advice to a lot of carriers, maybe if I can state that, is it doesn't need to wait for these technologies to come around. We, I think, have a lot of possibilities as an industry as well to achieve a lot through modal switches, through efficiency gains, through consumption reductions on operational or technical measures. So it doesn't always need to be the fanciest new technology to come around to have certain reduction aims, especially now at the beginning, I believe. However, to mention one interesting, it's not necessarily technology, I think it's more an approach to accelerate, for example, the use of SAF or biodiesel, is carbon insetting, or a book and claim mechanism that's coming more and more into the industry, which I think is a great way to have the technology or new fuels being adopted on a broader scale, which means that we are a little bit detaching who is fueling it and who is supporting it financially. That is in the end the idea of the book and claim. So I can drive a vehicle with diesel, but it can be for a different customer than the freight that is on my truck is from, just to make sure that we match supply and demand for these upcoming fuels, which I think is a good way to have some short and midterm developments of these technologies. And then I'm sure Charles will speak to the data technologies that we see, which I think also have helped a lot in the last years to support this exchange of data and the capturing of all of this.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I'll pass it over to you, Charles, there.
Yeah, I'm 100% aligned with Moritz. We see a lot of new technologies that will rise in like the next years, in 2030, 2050. But in my mind, we simply cannot wait for all these technologies to be ready.
No.
We need to act now. So I would rather talk about like a few examples that are short-term initiatives that can clearly reduce the emission, but more in terms of sobriety, I would say. And those are the kind of initiatives that we see already from our customers. So first one is it's quite clear. It's the modal shift. For long haul, we know that clearly from air to sea, we can reduce by 60 times the emission. Of course, this can only be done when the lead time is not the determining factor, because air is the only solution in that case. But otherwise, ocean freight should be prioritized if we look at the emissions. And if we look at short haul, well, we can also move from trucks to rail or inland waterways because we reduce the emission by 4 or 5 times. And we can see that in Europe, the rail is still not very adopted. It's only 17% of the inland transportation compared to 40% in the US. So it's a shame that we are not doing it, whereas it's possible. But for sure, there is a lack of infrastructure in Europe. Even in France, it's only 8% for the freight. So we can do better on that. And of course, if there is more demand from shippers, then at the end we will have more incentive to use this kind of modes. And so we can see that there is differences between two transport modes, but if we simply look at the same transport mode, we can clearly have optimization. I will take the example of the maritime. For instance, if you move a container from between a pair of ports, depending on the ocean service or the vessel that you are using, then the emission can be 4 times bigger. So it's huge, and it's in the same transport mode. So it's very important now that shippers can identify the greenest route in order to book on those, and for forwarders to propose those routes to their shippers. And that's actually something that at Wakeo we are working on, because we want to have a new product that will allow our customers to identify the greenest routes that they have from pickup to location, so including all modes of transport, and in the same mode be able to differentiate all the services, the vessels, so that they really can book on the greenest route.
That's great.
And the last short-term action that we've seen with one of our customers actually is to optimize the filling ratio of the containers or the trucks. This is clearly a double win, because you use less containers or less trucks, so it reduces the cost of transportation, and it reduces clearly the emissions. And this can be done by, for instance, switching from non-stackable pallets to stackable pallets, or to bulk fill the containers. Clearly, this has an impact on operation for loading and unloading, but at the end, the savings in terms of cost and emissions are clearly worth it. And that's actually an example from Clasquin. So it's a French freight forwarder, which is one of our customers. And by applying this with one of their customers, they were able to reduce by 15% their emission on a flow. So clearly, it's a short-term win that can be applied in terms of decarbonization, in my opinion.
That's great. And one other that we have discussed before, Charles, and you've posed, is changes in Incoterms. Do you want to touch on Incoterms here?
Yeah. It's a good way also to optimize. So it's from the same customer, from Clasquin. They've also switched the Incoterms for some of their customers, and that way they were able to combine different suppliers into the same containers. And so also by doing so, they were really able to optimize the filling of the containers, and not have like half fill on if they were not in charge of the transport. So it's really switching the Incoterm can be a good solution as well in order to optimize that. Yeah.
So I'll just come back and just quickly summarize those points, because Charles had lots of great ideas there to discuss. So we're talking about opportunities for changes through modal shifts, time allowing, of course. Huge reductions there possible, 60% reductions by changing your transport mechanism from air to maritime, or in a short haul scenario by switching from road to rail or inland waterways. Again, 4 to 5 times reduction possible there. Within the same transport mode, Charles touched upon within maritime, the fact that that by booking on the greener routes and looking at greener vessels, there are some significant savings that can be made there. So just comparisons between vessels can be significant. Then he touched on container optimizations by improving fill ratios. There are great opportunities for savings to be made there. And then finally, we looked at briefly at switching the Incoterms in order to be able to take greater control of container filling and being able to fill from multiple suppliers rather than leaving it for the suppliers to fill and manage the transport of goods. So what we're getting and what both of our experts talked about today is that the changes that we make, and particularly those first changes that are made, don't have to be cutting edge technologies. Instead, many of the optimizations that businesses can make are relatively quick wins. Now, I'm always a little hesitant when using that term, quick win, as when it comes to global logistics. All changes, of course, come with a degree of complexity and arbitration. But it is important to note that not all decarbonization measures have to require a great capital investment or changes to infrastructure to implement. Would you agree, guys?
For sure. And maybe just to add to the great summary there, I think especially also within a mode, and we see that some of the solutions that we are able to offer, but I think that in general for road transport, sometimes, especially in the express business, consolidation can have a huge impact. We see it especially in Europe, a lot of inner European flights or direct drives that are done for express cargo, where some consolidated networks like ours, but there's also others out there, but they already can cut significant emissions per transport shipment. So we see it's up to 50% on some of the main lanes that we run, just by putting more cargo in one truck, which seems so simple, but often that's not necessarily that easy to do. As you say, it's not necessarily a quick win. But we shuffling the supply chain and looking at the logistics setup as a shipper or as an LSP, I think can be hugely beneficial for long-term reductions as well.
Absolutely, reducing that empty mileage is key, isn't it? So Moritz is saying that you know those reductions almost at 50% by switching from direct drives to consolidated transport. In road, that certainly has plenty of opportunity for success. Now, Moritz, in our previous interview, which we had when we were building out the white paper, you mentioned the importance of collaboration for reaching a carbon neutral future for logistics. And this was one of the principal focuses of our white paper. So why do you consider collaboration to be such a cornerstone for decarbonizing global freight?
I believe that this whole journey is a very difficult one, obviously, and a massive undertaking for the industry. And it hits the shippers, the carriers, and the LSPs in between, I think, in the same way. Everybody needs to address it. It's not necessarily a competitive advantage all the time, or where you need to have a competitive environment. It's more about everybody having the same challenge and needing to find answers to the same questions. And I've seen, especially in my time at the Smart Freight Center, that's been very helpful to align, at least on, let's say, first of all, how do we measure emissions? You asked me earlier, what is the, based on how we calculated our footprint, we did this for the absolute footprint, we did it with a greenhouse gas protocol, which was also developed by various different institutions and companies. And then for the transport footprint, we are using the GLAC framework, which is the globally recognized methodology for it, which was developed again by LSPs, by shippers and carriers together, which I think helps a lot to make sure that the industry focuses then on reduction pathways. And even in those reduction pathways, we know that it's not going to be fully without investments that are needing to happen. So obviously there's low-hanging fruits, but in the end, we need to still be investing into the space. And that cannot be done by a shipper alone, by a carrier alone, but we need everybody to get to the table, and not just within the industry, but also, let's say, on a diagonal base, not just horizontal and vertical, but also talk to now fuel providers, infrastructure providers, truck manufacturers, maybe conversations that you didn't need to have before because everybody was running with the same assets. Now you have to think about how to completely change that infrastructure. And I think that cannot be done by one player or one group alone. It needs to be a mix of all these companies. And have an example, we were championing, let's say, HVO 100, is renewable biodiesel, to be allowed in Germany, which is currently not the case. We're using it heavily in the Netherlands, being able to reduce up to 80-90% of emissions. And now there has been a joint lobbying effort of the German Logistics Association, together with fuel providers, together with shippers, together with LSPs and carriers like us, for a joint positioning paper that has also now influenced the decision last week to actually allow biodiesel in Germany. And I think it's this necessity to come together as an industry to push for the same goal here.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. So that horizontal collaboration, aligning between competitors to get a greater voice, certainly helps to lobby for your common cause. It's great to see that there was a win on that front. That's a very positive thing to take out. Charles, is there anything that you'd like to add to Moritz's comments there? I'm conscious of the fact that I've made you go second throughout, so you've had a hard time of things, but is there anything that you'd like to add to Moritz's comments there?
Yeah, just one comment to add, but again, Moritz said a lot of very interesting things here. On collaboration, what we believe is key is also transparency between the different parties, between the carriers, their forwarders, the shippers, and that's one thing that we are trying to do at Wakeo, both in terms of visibility, but also in terms of CO2 emissions. And we are trying to bring down the silo between those parties. And by doing so, the goal is not to argue about the numbers and disagreeing about the calculations, but now companies with this transparency, they can start working on actions instead of really talking about numbers. And I think that's key. Like, now we know how to calculate. We need to have really good transparency between the parties. And once this is done, we can start working together to reduce and to decarbonize the freight.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So that transparency can breed a movement forwards, because that's exactly what we need now, isn't it? A movement away from getting into discussions about integrity of numbers and source of numbers, to actually moving forwards and seeing what can be done with them to move forward and start to decarbonize. That's a great point to end on. Okay, so I think we will now wrap up this conversation to allow for some time for questions from our attendees. I can see that we've had some come in already. If you haven't already posted yours, then please feel free to do so. You'll find a questions section in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And while I have a little look through those first questions, you'll also be able to find a link to our white paper that explores all of the concepts that we've been discussing today, and goes into some more detail on all of those. So lots of the terms that Moritz and Charles have been using, lots of the technologies, lots of the solutions that we discussed are all delved into within that white paper. So you should see that now. Okay. And I believe we have, this is a great question. I think I will pose this one to you, Moritz. This is a question from Eduardo. And Eduardo says, how can companies overcome the barrier of receiving accurate truckload percentages or empty return rates and CO2 data, or CO2 equivalent data from LSPs? So talking about the accuracy of measuring. So how can companies?
That's a very, very good question. I think that has been raised or is on the minds of a lot of people in the industry. I'm assuming now, not knowing where exactly Eduardo is coming from, but let's assume it might be a problem on the logistics service provider side, where you require or the shipper side, where you need the data then coming from the actual carriers. And I think that's where exactly we run into barriers today. There is a framework in general, which is always the first achievement, the GLAC framework, which regulates what kind of data should be shared in what kind of form and how carriers and LSPs should be collecting that data and reporting the data. Okay, Eduard from Henkel. Okay, perfect. Well, I'm aware that Henkel is also part of the Smart Trade Center, so I'll be well aware of the GLAC framework. But I think that the framework itself doesn't solve the issue. I think that's always a gap between maybe a theoretical approach and then the actual approach. And in the end, it requires, in my mind, a direct conversation where possible with the LSPs and with the carriers to align on how the data should be shared. And there's probably different assurance mechanisms that companies require. I think the question is also always, for what do you want to have the data, right? If it's purely for reporting purposes, there might be less assurance or more or less granularity that you need to get a first idea of your footprint. But the minute you start putting down reduction targets and you really want to see actions being carried out and you want to keep track of them, it's going to be insanely important to get accurate truckloads, empty runways, and so on. What I've seen in the past, I think it's good to start there with the first maybe top 10 or top 5, depending on your country and your focus at the moment, of carriers and LSPs to understand, okay, where's the data coming from? How can it look like? Seeing that Henkel probably has thousands of carriers, you will probably never get all of them to report the perfect data. But starting with the first of them can be very helpful, and then making sure that it's not just the LSP giving through the data, but also involving the carrier if possible. Because something that we can also see as a carrier right now, that even though we are able to provide the data in a certain format, in a certain way, our LSPs might not be directly able to work with that and give it on to their shipper, but maybe make their own calculations. And so what end up is that you have one package and the shipper might do their own calculations again, and you have 3 different calculations for the same shipment, because it's so hard for us to get the data through. So I would always say overcome that barrier by trying to have some use cases together with your LSPs and your carriers where possible, prioritize there on the severity of the trade lanes, and some kind of assurance I think is always needed there. That's one of the reasons why we decided to go, for example, now also after 2.5 years of internal calculations and internal software, to a third-party provider, because I think third-party providers can give a different assurance and integrity then also to your data points. I hope that gives a bit of an insight to Eduardo. Happy to elaborate further.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that starting point of identifying your core suppliers and working with them first. I mean, you can always scale these things out, but finding those for whom represent the greatest proportion of your transportation, start with them, work on the frameworks with them first. Things can then proliferate down, but to begin that collaborative journey, I think that's a great point to make. Charles, from your perspective, are there any points that you feel you could add to that discussion?
To be honest, I think Moritz made really some key points here. It's hard for me to add things to what he said here. It's very complete answer. Thank you, Moritz.
It is, I would agree. Yeah. Okay. I have another question from Goody. Are the greener ocean routes that we're seeing, we've stated are 4 times less emissions, are they longer than other ocean routes? And we're thinking about from a time perspective, and the time factor being obviously crucial for many within freight logistics. Is there a correlation between being greener and therefore taking longer, or not? I think
well,
one for you, Charles.
yes and no. I would say I would answer to that. So for sure, the longer you sail, the more fuel you consume and the more emission you have. So we could expect that the shortest routes are less emitting, but really it's key also to take into account the vessel that is transporting the goods, because there are still a lot of old container ships, and those one have are really more emittent per kilometer and per ton. So it's really two factors. Yes, of course, if it's shorter, it usually will emit less, but if it's the same vessel that is transporting the goods. So we really need to take the vessel that is transporting, and then sometimes a longer route, but with a more recent vessel would emit less in the end. And there is also the way that shipping lines are operating their vessels. It depends on the speed as well. So if you sail very fast, then you consume more and you emit more in the end. But for sure, the speed is harder to predict. That what speed will the vessel sail? But just having the distance and also the really what vessel we transport the goods are the two main factors here. To identify the greenest route.
Okay, so yes and no.
Yes and no. Clear, yeah.
Yes and no. There are a number of factors that contribute towards making those greener routes achievable, and as Charles touched upon, the fact that, and I think this will come, we will see this more and more. Obviously, the IMO 2023 standards will be looking quite heavily at vessel optimizations and efficiencies actually of the vessels, and so it isn't necessarily just a case of longer routes or slower routes. It can also be about the vessels themselves. Okay, one other question, which I think I would probably be best posing it at Charles again. For shippers, what do you see as a main challenge when it comes to measuring the carbon footprint of their transportation? And that's from Julie.
Yes. On that one, I think the biggest challenge is the lack of data and visibility in terms of data to measure, because to measure the emission, you need to know the weight that is transported. Usually shippers have that. So usually, because sometimes it's hard for them to get it. But then you have to know the vehicle that transports your goods. So you have to know the vessel, you have to know what aircraft, what type of trucks. This is very hard for shippers to gather all this information. And also, you have to know what distance was done by those vehicles, and this is not always easy for them because the shippers have a lot of freight, and to get the distance of each freight that is transported is not easy. Sometimes you book a direct service with a shipping line, and then you end up having a transshipment. So the distance is very different to what you would expect if you work on theoretical data. So I think, the lack of visibility in terms of data is one of the biggest challenge, and that's where we really at Wakeo try to help them, because we have this data as we are doing the track and trace for them. So we know the distance, we get the weight from the carriers, but also from the forwarders. We know the vehicle that is employed, that is used. So having this data ensure that you can measure correctly. And for a shipper, it's as I said earlier, it's sometimes a nightmare to try to gather all this information.
Yeah, absolutely. And moving from theoretical to actual, and again getting into that granularity, really is key to starting to gain control. But it's well, it hasn't been an easy task. I would like to think that with solutions such as yours, that really does help to bring such transparency and reduce the workload for people, so that they can stop focusing on spending most of their time trying to gather the numbers. The numbers can be there, and then they can actually spend their time working on the improvements, which is where it really comes into its own. I think that's a really great thing. Okay, this will be our last question, I think, today. Just squeeze it in before the end. This is from Enrico. Google Maps has quite recently introduced information about CO2 emission on the routes that you can select for a trip. Is this kind of technology, which we assume is based on AI, available in the tools used by logistics providers to optimize their routes? Moritz, is that one for you?
I can give it a try. I have seen that on Google Maps and I've seen advertisement on it. Again, I think focus obviously on public transportation at this point, I believe. I'm not sure that the providers have that. I know that there's obviously route optimization tools, which I know I've been looking into bringing this in as well, and looking a bit at Charles as well. I think what you said about the green corridors, that is a bit looking into what routes are best and trying to optimize the best based on the availability that it can have throughout optimizations. It does show, though, I think the requirements that maybe shippers have towards LSPs and carriers to provide solutions to the shippers that might not have that much insight into how actually routings happen. So I think also related to your first question, or to the question just now, data is missing, as Charles has said, and I think data is also missing in transparency of how transports might actually be happening. So if there's a transport between Beijing and Amsterdam, the shipper might not know exactly how it's routed. So I think it's an honest and also understandable request towards LSPs, towards carriers to optimize it and also offer optimized routings and transparency on that. As far as I'm aware, that's not necessarily yet happening in the biggest scheme that it could be.
That's great. Well, Charles, unless you have anything else to add on that particular question, I think that is no. Okay, fantastic. Well, I hope that answers it for you, or at least gets the conversation moving, Enrico. Thank you so much to you all for joining and listening to us today. I hope that you've all taken something away. There'll be, I believe, a slide at the end with a link to the white paper, which again, as I say, will help to give you some greater context into all of the things that we discussed today. And thank you so much to Moritz and to Charles for joining me and for giving us all your insights and expertise on the subject. It's a fascinating one on which we could talk for hours, I believe. But it's been great talking with you today. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Lindsay.
And goodbye.
All right, bye bye.